In our increasingly electrified society, that's where a resilient grid matters most. ITC Great Plains is ensuring the greater grid can meet our energy needs now and long into the future. Learn more at itc-holdings.com.
And hello, welcome to Smoky Hills PBS. I'm Becky Kaiser, and you are going to find out a little bit about one of the candidate races for Kansas. I am delighted to welcome for the 119th District our two candidates from Dodge City. Closest to me on my right is Brad Ralph, who is an incumbent. He is from Dodge City. And on my left this evening is Jason Goetz, also a Dodge City resident. And we're going to take the opportunity this evening to find out a little bit about them, and then their ideas and suggestions for what should happen in the state legislature as either one of them will be elected. And of course, a reminder that the election is coming up August 2nd, and we certainly encourage you to get out there and vote. We had a coin toss right before we got together this evening, and Brad Ralph was the winner of that coin toss. That means that Brad will have the opening statement first, a little bit about himself, followed by Jason, and then Brad will have the opportunity to start with the first question this evening. And each of our time periods tonight will be a minute 30, 90 seconds. Again, I'm Becky Kaiser. I am from Eagle Communications in Hayes, Eagle Radio, and Hayes Post News, and I am delighted to have you this evening and our candidates. So Brad, let's start with you, and with your opening statement, please, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, Becky, and thank you for being here this evening. Appreciate your efforts. Moved to Dodge City in 1964 when I was 5. Came out here when my dad came to the police department to get on there. Attended Dodge City schools all the way through, as did, I think, everybody on the panel here tonight is a Dodge City graduate. Went through Dodge City schools, started in South Dodge at Sunnyside Elementary, all the way up. Graduated from St. Mary of the Plains College in Dodge. Stayed home to go to school there. I graduated from Washburn Law School in 1984 in Topeka and practiced for a little while in Topeka. About the time my kids got into school, moved back to Dodge City. Of course, my folks were in Dodge City and my wife's folks were out in eastern Colorado, which made us a little closer to family and got us back to an area that we both wanted to be in. I went into private law practice with Ken Strobel and Jim Williams in a firm downtown. My wife of 40 years, Shannon, we have 3 children and 5 grandchildren. I have my own private practice. Pretty much my sole client right now is the City of Dodge City, and I'm the city attorney there, handling any variety of items there for the city other than the city prosecution. I'm finishing my 6th year in the legislature, serve on the Appropriations Committee in the first 2 years. Since then, I serve as Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee, serve on the Commerce Committee, as well as I was Vice Chair of the Redistricting Committee this past year.
All right, thank you very much for your introduction, Brad. We'll go now to Jason Goetz, who also, again, is from Dodge City, and we'll have Jason introduce himself. Jason is a novice to the political arena. He's going to tell us why he's decided to do this.
Hi, I'm Jason Goetz, and I was born and raised in Dodge City. My family moved there when my grandparents moved from Park, Kansas, down and bought land just out west of town and started a family farm there that moved it down. And my dad was 6, and we've been there ever since. And the roles that I've had in Dodge City, again, Dodge City Public Schools, and had a lot of fond memories of basketball and teammates, and shout out to Coach Hamilton and teammates in the past, and graduated in 1998 and had a basketball scholarship and graduated from then Sterling College right outside of Hutchinson, and a lot of great memories there. And that was a year that the Lord really got a hold of my life and guided me in the direction of ministry. And so I graduated with a religious and philosophical studies degree, and it moved me in a direction of pastoring in the Dodge City area for the last 18 years in various roles, and mentoring youth, helping families relationally, mending bridges in the community. I just have a deep heart for Dodge City, and that's the main reason that I wanted to step into a new challenge and a new chapter and see what this realm could have for me and what I could add to it. I want to care for people and care for our community.
All right, thank you very much, Jason. Let's start with our first question this evening. Brad, we'll start with you again as the coin toss winner. And of course, as you said, you are an incumbent, so if you're reelected, you have some institutional knowledge of what has happened in the legislature. What I'd like for you to talk about this evening is currently, what do you feel are maybe the 3 top major needs for the state of Kansas right now? What will help just improve lives for the average Kansan?
Well, I think in terms of just, thank you, Becky, in terms of just identifying areas, particularly in western Kansas, but I think statewide, it's been pretty clear that folks are concerned about workforce issues, they're concerned about housing, and they're concerned about economic development. And everybody will have some variety of other issues, but as you go along, just the general conversation will always focus on those. I've always been pretty proud of the way Dodge City has handled some of their housing issues right now, economic development going very strong. So we're doing a good job out our direction, but I think those are going to be a big focus. I think as people may have heard, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along, but I also serve on the Commerce Committee, and the announcement this afternoon that Panasonic has chosen Kansas to bring in their electric car battery plant. We're going to be bringing in 4,000 jobs in a $4 billion project. That came directly out of work done in the Commerce Committee. I serve on that committee this past year, and it showed that Kansas can compete and does compete with surrounding states in terms of bringing people in. We'll talk a little more, I'm sure, on down the road during this hour about Dodge City specifically bringing in the Hillmar cheese factory or cheese plant. That's going to be a significant item. Along with those then also comes the issue of housing, and right now Dodge City has focused itself on some really good housing programs that they're taking advantage of.
An area of growth in southwest Kansas. And Jason, for you, and we might also mention that another new chapter in your life is you are now in the construction business, and that's directly related to the need for housing in southwest Kansas. Tell us what you believe the top 3 needs are for the state.
I would agree, just being in that industry, it's one thing to have jobs for people, but if there's not housing, it's hard to keep those people there and even get them to move into a rural circumstance. And so I would agree with that one, and there's an uphill climb there with inflation and interest rates rising to be able to get young families into a good home or families into a home that they can own and build a life. I think probably one of the bigger issues for me, just in my background, is just kind of the decline morally in ideas that are shaping our culture, shaping our youth, moving maybe towards a weaker nuclear and just family environment. And so I would say some of those moral issues would be higher from just my perspective of addressing those. Some of the value of them both amendment, having this strong stance on life and liberty in our state. And from there, I think you can move into the economic things, and money talks, but I think the morals are really the heartbeat of a culture, and want to see those bolstered and returned where they can be.
All right, thank you, Jason. Our next question, back to Brad Ralph, and this has been discussed off and on, I know, in the legislature for some time, the opportunity and whether or not there should be expansion of Medicaid in Kansas. Brad, what do you think?
Well, I think I was very much on record when I first went into the legislature. I ran on part of the item of strengthening our schools and an expansion of the Medicaid program. In that first year that I was in the legislature, that issue came up. It was narrowly defeated. It really has not come to the forefront again since that time. Personally, I would like to see an expansion there. I think it's an economic issue, particularly for rural communities such as ours. We recently we're very fortunate to have a local hospital. Recently that hospital ownership has changed hands, and again, we're very fortunate to have that in the community, but I think it would be a plus. But in reality, I don't see that issue necessarily coming to the forefront again in terms of issues that might be presented for consideration, either in committee or on the floor. So regardless of my take or position on that, I don't see that gaining a lot of traction in the near future. But I have been supportive of it in the past. I don't like seeing it kind of used as a ploy. Sometimes we've seen it come up as an amendment on the floor sometimes in the legislature in the last several years. Not a serious effort, and I'm not supportive of things that aren't serious efforts, and I've voted against those. But I'm supportive of it in general, and if we had a chance to consider it, I would be supportive again.
All right. Jason Goetz, what is your feeling on the possibility of Medicaid expansion? If you were elected, how would you vote on that?
I would probably be with knowing what I know and just kind of my smaller governance mindset. It would be in the direction of probably opposing it without the right stipulations and moving it in a direction that protects people from. I haven't seen government be as efficient as maybe a private business, and be in a place where if it's too big, it's not manageable, and putting it in a place where maybe the government gives incentives to the private sector solving that problem, helping solve that problem, and gives tax breaks, whatever the case may be, but move it in the direction of let's see what incentives government can make before government tries to just take on a bigger problem. And let's see how we can promote personal responsibility in our communities to help solve problems with incentives from the government.
All right, thank you, Jason. Our next question, back to Jason with this, and Jason, earlier you talked about you feel that there's a real need and would support working with families and talking about the values amendment and voting for that, and building family connections among Kansas families. But you also talked about, realistically, money has to have a part in this. What do you think the most important budget issue is facing the state at this point?
I would say, I think it's close to 50% of the budget would be education, and in just making sure that money is being used well. I've been kind of doing some research and talking to some people where there is I'm kind of blanking the exact terminology, but it's a needs building, a building needs assessment, and it's something that is in law, but our school systems they're not exercising it. There was only 2 that actually filled out the assessment, and I would just like to see if that much money in the budget is going to the schools, let's help it in every way that we can be effective. And so that building needs assessment would kind of assess where are kids behind, how can we get them further ahead if they're ahead, and it would place that money, if we're talking about those resources, it would place that money as close to where it needed to be as possible. And I just thought that was a really good idea. And on that budget item, that being the biggest one, that would probably be one that I would look at it and see how we can effectively spend that money helping kids.
All right. Brad, we do know, of course, that as Jason pointed out, this is the biggest part of the budget for the state legislature every year, funding K through 12 education. Is there something beyond that is probably, that in your opinion, is the biggest budget concern?
I don't think so. I think he makes a good point in terms of we have a significant amount of money that goes from our budget in there. Obviously, economic development is an issue and such, but in regard, I think we want to make sure that we keep clear that the legislature appropriates the money to the school systems we have local boards of education that make funding decisions as to where money is spent. And I just want to say at this point, for example, Dodge City has, last I heard, the 5th largest high school in the state of Kansas. So we have a very significantly sized school system in Dodge City. Our Board of Education does a tremendous job over the last many years. We've had several long-term incumbents on that board, and their spending decisions and their efforts with money are done very well and with a lot of consideration. So I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind and we try to focus on is there are things that the state legislature does and there are things that other elected officials do. And to use a worn phrase at the moment, it's very difficult sometimes for us in Topeka to stay in our lane in regard to some of these issues. Right now we are completing funding that has been required out of the litigation 5-6 years ago, and I think we should be very proud of that. But right now, I'm very confident in the spending decisions that are being made by our local school board, and that our facilities and our schools in Dodge City are doing very well in that regard.
All right. Our next question, Brad, we'll start with you on this one. This has been a hot topic around the country and in Kansas. Do you support legalizing marijuana for recreational use or medicinal use, perhaps?
It has been a subject that has been hot even within the State House, and there are a lot of conversations going on at the State House over the last several years. It becomes somewhat of a difficult question to answer just because there are such a variety of proposals that are made in regard to that. Let's say first off, I would certainly not support recreational legalization of marijuana. That's just not even part of the process right now. I do believe there are reasonable arguments to be made for medicinal use legalization. But again, at this point, I haven't seen anyone come forward with a really good proposal as to how that would occur. It's also one of those items that in Topeka that we do a really good job most of the time coming through the committee process for committees to work through proposed legislation before it comes to the House floor, before it would then go to the Senate. And the committees have worked through those pretty well, but so far I haven't heard any particular proposal kind of distilled down to something that they think they can move through. For example, the House, 125 members, you got to find at least 62 of those, 63 of those just to get through the House. I haven't heard anything distill through, but I would certainly be open to a proposal, a reasonable proposal that might consider medicinal marijuana. Recreational marijuana is just not going to be an item that I would support.
And we should point out that it's not legal at the federal level. That's part of the problem, correct?
Yeah, and I always hate to get to a spot where we're blaming it on the feds, but that certainly is a piece of it that has to be addressed at the federal level, yes.
All right. So let's go to our other candidate this evening and find out what his position is on whether you would favor legalizing marijuana if elected and the opportunity comes up, if it might be legalized for recreational use or for medicinal use in Kansas. What do you think, Jason?
Sure, very, very similar. That it just poses a bit of a slippery slope that we've seen around the country, to where if medicinal use does get fully legalized, we've seen the recreational use and some of the other things that go with too much recreational use kind of rise and not defeat a community, but put another burden on it when we were trying to give an aid and a help to people who were hurting, with the medicinal purposes. And so it would be, the details would really matter of how that gets regulated in that, and finding the right language, having enough conversations, listening to enough people, asking all the right people, how can this help? And if it's done right, would it help or would it harm? And I would probably be in the middle right now, definitely opposed to recreational use legalization. I just don't think that helps anyone at this point, but looking into the right way to safely, for communities, offer that aid to people who are in pain and suffering. I definitely think it's something that needs to be considered of how do we do it the right way.
All right. Jason, as Brad mentioned earlier, we're all from Dodge City and grew up in the southwest Kansas area. And you, of course, have also been very involved with family farm for several generations. What are some of the things that you feel like are the most important concerns for southwest Kansas? Does ag have a interest in that?
Ag has a huge place in my heart, but also, just even with our personal family farm, the main topic of water, is right where we're at. Even right now, second cutting of alfalfa, and my dad is talking about maybe get 1.5 more cuttings out of it, and before we have to, legally shut off the water and how much you can pump, and rightfully so on regulating that, so we extend the life of the aquifer as long as we can. But what other options are we going to give farmers? Is there some options out there to work with energy companies for putting solar on the corners, and ways that we can incentivize and help give ideas to our farmers that are brilliant? I mean, brilliant, all the hats they have to wear. I watched my father do it for so many years, and so many other great farmers in the area. But I think we're going to have to, the water is not going to just reappear. And so that would probably be the biggest one. The other one right now that's so big, that's close to that, but it's just the cost of goods. I mean, just the cost of fuel to go through the wheat field this year. Basically, yeah, the price of wheat was good, but the fuel cost was so high that it almost made it not worth doing it.
The input expenses. All right. Brad, you mentioned earlier, we were talking about things that have happened in Kansas, and specifically southwest Kansas, Dodge City. You talked about, I don't know if that's the right term, cheese factory that's coming. Tell us about that. I would assume that that's something that may be a concern. And what about the water use for that? Oh,
absolutely. A couple of things to point out. Yes, we're extremely excited that Hilmar Cheese is coming into Dodge City. That's about a 20-month project. We're expecting, as I recall, somewhere just under 300 new jobs coming in with the Hilmar Cheese Factory. First off, one of the things that Hilmar has indicated, and we are certain of, and they've been working very hard at, they will be a water neutral facility coming in there. One of the things you keep in mind is the milk that's coming in is almost all water. So they're almost a positive output of water coming out of there. And as Dodge has had for many years, we've got at our wastewater treatment plant toward the end, water coming off of that goes into irrigation. We also have a bio plant down there where we pull off the methane gas and sell that. So I'm very proud of the efforts that Dodge City has made in that regard. It'd be a tremendous addition to our ag community there in Dodge City, tremendous addition to the community in general. But as we address the ag issues in Topeka, I've always been very, very dependent and reliant upon input from Kansas Farm Bureau, the Livestock Association, Agribusiness Council. All of those entities have endorsed my candidacy and my campaign in this particular election. Rely on them a lot for their efforts. And I think a lot of times what we'll run into, Becky, in terms of, for example, we talk about the increase in inputs. Sometimes Topeka and the legislature just has to stay out of the way of ag and just not make it tougher for them in terms of trying to be able to bring down some of those costs.
All right. Well, I want to stay on the topic of agriculture. And Brad, let's return to you again. We recently, well, I guess about a month ago in mid-June, we're in the heat of summertime now across Kansas, but unfortunately had a situation where the heat was so bad that a number of cattle were killed by the heat situation in southwest Kansas, and there's been concern that perhaps this could happen again. We know in other cases where there have been natural disasters that the state has stepped in and helped out in different ways, including financial aid at times. Is there anything you think that the state should or could do, particularly with the cattle producers in southwest Kansas or anywhere else in the state?
Well, I would suspect right now, Becky, and again in reliance upon some of the associations, but I suspect right now the cattle producers, if they wanted some assistance from us, it wouldn't necessarily be in regard to the heat. There may be some other concerns in regard to markets and such that they would be much more concerned about. And I don't have a lot of depth there, so I'll kind of leave that in that point. But not to minimize at all the deaths that occurred, but I think sometimes people lose track of the fact of the number of head of cattle that we have in western Kansas and southwest Kansas. And although those numbers were significantly increased, and although those pictures are rather telling for someone who's not familiar with the area, the loss there, I think you would find from our producers, they would tell you that it wasn't outrageous in terms of numbers as you compare it to the number of cattle in that corner of the state. And I'll probably just leave it there, but in regard to that specific instance, I think that that got blown up a little bit in some of our urban areas as they looked at those pictures and started talking about things they didn't really have a lot of depth of understanding about.
Jason, how about you when it comes to the death of those cattle? And we know they're brought up in an area that tends to have that kind of weather. Do you think the state should step in and help out somehow?
In drought years, there has been times where there will be some kickbacks if there was loss and farmers were forced to sell off their herd because of no grazing. So I think just some of the current programs would probably be able to aid that just as well as creating a new one and the whole process of going through that again. I would say kind of just stay out of it and make sure that we're not promoting like a culture of fear, in that we're staying in a path of, okay, we can be concerned that there's some of the fear language of these food shortages, and I understand that's a good thing to kind of keep your hand on or keep your pulse on, but make sure we're looking around. We're an abundant country, and is there some supply chain things that have shifted and are harder right now? Yes, but we have plenty. And we don't have to dip into a fear-based mindset about things. We can find the positive. Farmers are resilient. They're some of the most resilient people that I've ever been around or worked with. And so I bet their suggestion would be just let us get back to work, and we'll take care of it.
All right. Jason, I wanted, and this may be something where legislature should not necessarily get involved, but we heard another news story today about inflation being so high it affects everybody across the United States and around the world. But anyway, inflation at its highest in 40 years. Record high gasoline prices for people that are just driving their cars, but I can't even imagine what kind with input for the farming industry. You're in construction now as well. We know that the prices there are pretty high. Is there anything that you think the state could do to help remediate those prices? And let me ask too, not only that, but is there any way we can assist the average Kansan to, with their budget?
Well, I don't know exactly what drilling rights, as far as, President Biden kind of shut down oil type stuff and made it more difficult for us to be independent, and moved the needle in that direction. So just being a novice at it, I don't know exactly what the authority in the state of Kansas to be able to move a needle in a direction to where we could just open up the access to our oil and gas that we have. And how it's affecting families for us with buying a home is that inflation and those interest rates, that we have really high prices and then we have really high interest rates. And it moves a payment for a new house in a place where a family has to continue to say, no, we'll just rent until that comes down. And could we come in and regulate that? Again, I'm so new that I don't really know, but I care about it enough to step in and try and learn and see what we can do.
All right. Brad, how about you? Is there anything that the state legislature could do to help the inflation factor and bring that down somehow, or maybe help families out with their budgets?
Specifically in response to the question about can we affect inflation, no. There's nothing we can do specifically affecting inflation, but you like to believe that pieces of legislation. For example, in this last session, we made a little bit of progress in regard to some property taxes. There was in the last tax bill that came out, we made some progress in terms of people over 65 in certain circumstances. We were able to put in place legislation that would, in essence, create a base year for their property taxes on a homestead, a house that they live in, and then be able, going forward from that, if those property taxes increase, they would be in, if they satisfied their criteria, they would be in line for a rebate of payments over that base year. So there are things we can do, or some of the scholarship programs that were put in place for kids or young people that are looking at 2-year degrees. There are things we can do to try to bring a little bit of relief to families in terms of expense and cost right now. Specifically on inflation, no, but again, I go back to, I think one of the things that we can do right now in many instances from a state legislature standpoint is stay out of the way. Reduce some regulation. Don't continue to pile on. As a matter of fact, in this last session, we passed some legislation to start trying to cut back on some regulation. If we can do that, it helps the businesses, and anything we can do to help the businesses bring down some of that cost, that's obviously going to transfer down to consumers as well.
I'm sorry, I had to smile when you say regulation to help reduce regulation, but I guess that's what it takes, actually. So Brad, let's stay with you, and that kind of dovetails over into what I wanted to ask you about. And you mentioned before the announcement that, I don't know how official it is, but at least I know a Japanese news agency earlier today saying that yes, the Panasonic battery plant is going to be built in Kansas. 4,000 jobs, as you mentioned. But I know when this was, there was a lot of hush-hush about it because of, obviously you're competing across the United States and perhaps in the world. There was some testimony that came from the Kansas State Finance Council saying that, it is a good idea. There's some incentive, tax breaks that could help seal the deal. And yet there was also some concern that perhaps we should, instead of doing that for one big business coming in, why not give a tax break to every business in Kansas, including ones that come in, and mom and pop and the big box stores? Would that not be more productive and effective? What do you think?
Well, and I think it's appropriate to ask me what I think, because having served on the Commerce Committee for the last several years, during this session, the Commerce Committee, where I was a participant, was the one on the House side that actually, what I will say, put together the final deal that was then approved by the legislature, approved by the governor, and put in front of what we now know to be Panasonic for this particular proposal. And there was a lot of conversation and back and forth in that regard. I think what we come down to anymore is the reality is, if you are going to bring in a business of this size, and I think what they called this particular legislation was the apex legislation, hearkening back to an apex predator just because of the sheer size of it. If you're going to compete with the opportunity to bring jobs in and bring workforce in and move the state forward in regards to economic development, you're going to have to play in that particular arena in terms of the size of that project. There are certainly arguments to be made about trying to simply do a rebate across the state. I think what that ultimately came down to was long-term effect of that is not going to be the same as bringing in a business like this because of the peripheral business. This Panasonic plant, as reported right now, is bringing in 4,000 jobs. They expect the total job creation to be 8,000 because of the periphery of that in terms of other businesses.
All right. Jason, tell us your opinion on, is it a good idea, which apparently we've done that. Well, it has happened, and assuming that this does go forth and confirmed by the governor, I guess sometime today yet, good way to conduct business for the state? Or are we looking, what would you think about, let's make a rebate to everybody that already has a small business or big business in Kansas?
I would probably prefer the latter, that it was shared, but I understand the concept of, if you can hook a big fish, then you get some of the surrounding, the Dodge City one with Hilmar, and that's going to create construction industry and other industry, and so that we got to fish, and we got to try and stay competitive at bringing people to Kansas. I think some of the some of the fear got into that when stuff is hush hush, that, and was like, who's coming? Is China coming, or who's coming? And I just wonder how that helps the 119th. You know, what we're running for on the other side of the state, getting a big bonus, a big move, all that, and what are we contributing to help do that, or what did we miss out on in giving that away to somebody else that we could have given to those farmers that are dealing with water issues, and those construction companies that are dealing with high rates, and just the list goes on and on. So I probably would have, I'm sure there was discussion about how do we do that, but I probably would have tried to fight for the little guy just as much as going for the larger company that could bring more.
Brad, do we know where this is slated to be located, this company?
Excuse me, the last I understand is they talked about the old Sunflower munitions plant outside of DeSoto, and I think that's actually going to end up being the location. And as was mentioned right there, as a result of the Commerce Committee and my participation there, later on in the year, we were also, through my efforts with the House leadership, we were able to secure approximately another $30 million from COVID funds and such that were available in the state to seal the deal with the Hilmar Cheese Factory. So to the point of what did we get out in our neck of the woods, bringing that particular project across the finish line for Hilmar, because they obviously at the end of their project, as so many other places, increased prices and such, it required some state participation, and through my efforts in that regard, we were able to bring that together, seal the deal, and we bring Hilmar in there. And also partially from the standpoint of, okay, what'd they get in the east? Well, what are we getting for it out in the west? Well, that's part of what we got.
All right. Jason, back to you now. And as you know, living in western Kansas, there does sometimes seem to be sort of a divide between rural western Kansas and the more populated eastern part of the state. But something that affects all of us, and we've mentioned this already within the show, is that coming up in our election on August 2nd, one of the issues that will be voted on is a question about a change to the Kansas Constitution. And I want to find out if you are elected, and if that protection, protect them both is what that's being called, if that amendment would pass on August 2nd and you were elected, would you, as a representative, vote to ban abortion in Kansas? And if not a total ban, what exceptions would you allow?
Probably where I would start was working with that Value Them Both bill of implementing some of the just regulations and proper reporting on the abortion industry, and at least putting a ban on late-term abortions. We're becoming kind of a destination for other states that are not allowing that, and so people are coming in and doing that in our state. And morally, and just my stance, 100% for life. As there are difficult circumstances that basically an irresponsible culture is moving people in a direction that now we're dealing with these consequences, and how can we figure out how to deal with them responsibly? And so my initial push would be, let's work right inside the Value Them Both amendment. If that gets passed, and I hope it does, and I'm going to vote for it on August 2nd, and then move those checks into place on the state's abortion industry, and see what we learn, and see how we can progress forward in moving towards a spot in our country. I know this is unimaginable, but I imagine it to where we don't need that, to where abortion isn't a need in our community, to where there's resources and there's availability for women and for children, that we don't need that. Not that we need to ban it, but that we just don't need it anymore.
All right. And Brad, your response to that, if you're reelected and if the amendment is passed by the voters of Kansas, would you vote to ban abortion? And if not a total ban, what exceptions would you allow?
I guess the direct answer to your question is no. I wouldn't vote for a total ban of abortion. But again, to get to a spot where we're trying to anticipate what any of those potential pieces of legislation might be, it's very difficult at this point. The people in the state of Kansas are presented with a very unique circumstance right now in terms of the Kansas Supreme Court having made the Hodes decision several years ago, and now the people of the state of Kansas are going to get an opportunity to directly respond to a decision of the Kansas Supreme Court in response to whether their constitution provides, in essence, a right to abortion or not. And that's the type of circumstance that a people in a state don't normally get to deal with, because the Kansas Constitution is in fact the voice of the people of Kansas. That's even the legislature, that's who we respond to. We don't get to make laws that don't comply with what the Constitution is. So I'm hoping that people take to heart the significance of this opportunity to vote on the value of them both amendment. To go on from that, at that point though, I will say I was in the legislature when that amendment was, as in terms of legislation, was proposed to be presented to the voters, was part of those conversations. As a result of my part of the work, as well as many others, my candidacy is endorsed by the Kansans for Life in that regard. And I'm hopeful that the people of Kansas will be very thoughtful about that as they approach the ballot box. And I would encourage them, this is one of those questions they really need to give some consideration to, what the yes and the no's are.
All right, thank you, Brad. Jason, let's come back to you and a really kind of a broad question. If you are elected, what 3 things would you like to accomplish in the legislature?
My platform is faith, family, and freedom, and I want to try and fight for keeping those high in my values. And probably the first one in faith would be the value of them both amendment. You know, if it gets voted in, helping, and if I'm voted in and be able to see what that implementation process looks like and help with, you know, next bills that are coming in to support that, that would be top tier priority. In the realm of family, there's a few of them. The Fairness in Women's Sports Act, I would like to see women's sports protected, biological males be in a spot where they're competing against biological males and biological females competing against biological females. We've seen stories across the country of women's sports being damaged because there wasn't clear lines on that. I mentioned it earlier, the building assessment needs, Parents' Bill of Rights in the family realm, but then on the freedom one, probably blocking the advancement of Medicare, just from my value set of smaller government. Let the community incentivize the local responsible individuals in the community that could solve that problem locally. So faith, family, freedom, those would be the 3 areas that I would try and find the right lane to make a difference, make an impact.
All right, Jason, thank you. And Brad, as the incumbent, perhaps there are some leftover issues that you've thought about that you want to concentrate on. But again, if elected, what 3 things would you like to accomplish this time around?
Well, excuse me, I think in many instances, particularly as you go into the legislature and into the legislative session, sometimes you realize that where you would like to head isn't necessarily where the group is heading in those instances. And it's one of the things I've figured out over the last 6 years in that regard, because you spend your time in Topeka, start session in January, you're normally there till May or June. By the time you get out in May or June, you've got another couple of, I've always had another couple of months of interim committee meetings, redistricting goes on. I serve on the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, which is a multi-state commission that deals with, in essence, Amtrak issues. So I'm out either in Topeka or Kansas City or Wichita or Washington, D.C. about 8 months out of the year dealing with the issues. So being able to identify 3 of them, economic development is always an issue that we want to be able to focus on in some fashion. And my guess is, with several of these big projects going on right now, there's going to have to be some follow-up on those. You don't have projects that big and not have something else to be dealing with. We'll always be dealing with education in some regard. My focus has always been, I like local officials making local decisions, and it's kind of unique in the 119th. We have a city commission, a county commission, a a board of trustees at the community college and a board of education, which gives you about 20 elected officials. And I think a lot of the times my main focus is just making sure that I don't try to do their job for them.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Back to the election, and this has been talked about across the United States with the past presidential election, and then there are some things that have come down to other states, including Kansas. Basically, we're talking about the idea of decreasing. What can we do to prevent voter fraud? And there have been talks about restrictions. If we increase restrictions to prevent voter fraud, are we not also, I guess on the other side of the coin, restricting voter turnout in some ways or discouraging people to come to the polls? Do you, Brad, think we have a problem with voter fraud in Kansas? And are we kind of squashing people down and discouraging them from voting in any way?
It is incredibly important that we encourage every voter who is eligible to vote to go out and vote. And I'm sure both of us sitting here today are encouraging folks to do that. And if I'm remembering right, today or tomorrow is the first day of advanced balloting, I think. Yes, it starts off. So would encourage people to get out and do that. But the second part of your question, let me unequivocally state the elections in Kansas are amongst the most secure elections in the country. And that's right now directly attributable to our Secretary of State, Scott Schwab. And so I think it's incredibly important for elected officials to require accountability and to ask hard questions on issues where those arise. But I also believe that there is also an incumbent responsibility for elected officials in the appropriate circumstances to express confidence in whether it's institutions or activities or whatever. And this is one of those circumstances where I believe it's incredibly important for state officials at every level to encourage folks and let them know that they can have complete confidence in our elections in the state of Kansas. And again, I think that's directly attributable to the leadership efforts of Scott Schwab and the Secretary of State's office right now.
All right. Jason, what are your feelings on that? We know that there have been talks about increasing restrictions, and there have been some to prevent voter fraud, but is that kind of coming back to haunt us and suppressing voter turnout in any way?
I believe it can be, just because I think more so the trust, whether it's true or false, it seems like the trust is deteriorating in is my vote counting, and the more transparent those organizations can be, whether it's at the federal or the state level, and just trying to, and I'm not saying that they're not, but helping get that transparency out in front of common people. And not everybody goes digging for that information, but they'll get a Facebook ad or they'll get another kind of fear-mongering idea, but we don't know who to trust in these times. And so finding credible information at the state level, I think just helping promote transparency at that government level. I don't necessarily think in Kansas we had a major problem, but there is quite a bit of evidence that in some other places that there was, and so that transfers over to where you're at and starts you questioning. And I think the more we can meet people in those fears and bring them out with truth back into, okay, here's our reality. Maybe that did happen over here, but over here it didn't, and here's the clear lines of why it didn't. Just be clear, create that transparency, we'll be good.
All right. Well, we are down to our last question of the evening. We have been visiting with the candidates for the 119th District House of Representatives, the Dodge City area. Joining us this evening has been the incumbent Brad Ralph, who is to my right, and also newcomer Jason Goetz is with us. And Jason, I want to give you the opportunity to start with this final question. You talked about your platform and some of the things that are important to you if elected, but if you are elected as the representative, is there any special legislation that you would like to introduce, support it, and hopefully see it through the legislature?
I would say one of the greatest things that I would like to see, and as I was thinking about running and moving in that direction, I really wanted to find a cause that I felt like was at maybe the core of a lot of the problems that we can banter about, whose opinion this and whose opinion that, but what's the hope solution that you would bring over? And for me, a core of the hope solution is promoting personal responsibility with every individual and moving them communities in a direction to where, kind of like my opponent said, was that we put life back in their hands and we promote responsibility in their life. And how do you do that in legislation? I think it really comes down to less legislation and less governance, to where there's more freedom and people can move into a life that's their dream. That's what they want to do. I think Dodge City is a great reflection of people who are moving forward in life, taking responsibility for their family, for their faith, and not trying to go so big that they miss the special details in every day. So do I have an answer for exactly what that bill would look like? No. But finding ways to promote responsibility at the personal level would be my highest goal.
All right, Jason, thank you. And Brad, how about you? Any special legislation that you, if reelected, would like to introduce, support it, and hopefully see it through?
Actually, in the next session, there's no specific piece. In the last session, I shepherded through a task force that met for the last 2 years that was doing a major overhaul of DUI laws in the state of Kansas. And that's not really a sexy issue, but it was way overdue for about 10 years. I chaired that committee and was able to bring that through those 2 years, bring it to fruition and passed in this last session. I think going forward, if reelected, in these next 2 years, my focus would be on making sure that Western Kansas, and specifically Southwestern Kansas, has a solid, experienced, knowledgeable voice in leadership in the House of Representatives in Kansas. We have a significant amount of turnover going on in the House again this year, as we normally do, but a significant number of chairmanships that are retiring. As I indicated before, I was vice chair of the redistricting committee this year, vice chair of the Judiciary Committee. I would expect an opportunity to move into a leadership position of some committee, and that's significant when you consider that, you know, in Seward County we have a representative that is chair of a transportation budget committee. Up in the northwest corner we've got the chair of the tax committee. It's significant with our decreases in population and the lessening of the numbers of representatives in Western Kansas. It's important for us to have the longevity and maintain and attain those leadership positions in the House to make sure Western Kansas is heard.
All right. We have concluded our questionings of the two gentlemen this evening, and time now for our closing statements. Again, following the roll of the coin earlier, we will allow Brad Ralph to have the first opportunity for his closing statement this evening. Brad.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you for your time this evening. Appreciate your efforts in that regard. I think the only thing that I would close with is, after these last 6 years, I've been honored to represent the 119th District in the House of Representatives. I'm asking for your votes so that I can continue that work for at least for the next 2 years. It's significant, and I hope folks will realize how significant it is, as we have experienced in some areas, not necessarily in Ford County or some of the Southwest Kansas counties, but we are losing population in some of our rural areas, and that translates, as we've seen in the last redistricting, that translates into less representation in Topeka for rural areas, or what I sometimes like to refer to as frontier areas. And it will become more and more important for those areas to have longevity in their representatives in order that we can have greater voices in leadership within the legislature. Otherwise, we get swept along, and as much as I like working with my colleagues from the more urban areas, it's important that we don't get swept along with the 5 large counties and just end up being yes people for them in what is important in those larger populous counties. So at this point, it's just my fervent desire to continue to represent you, to give you a reasoned, mature voice in the state legislature, and again, ask for your vote on August 2nd.
All right. Thank you, Brad Ralph. And Jason Goetz, you have the final word this evening. Your closing statement for us, please.
Well, and thank you both for this opportunity and to be able to talk tonight. And yes, in running, one of my pain points was the local representation. And I believe that I am the local option for Dodge City. I may not have the experience in the legislature, but I have been knocking on doors, and a lot of you are very excited about this opportunity for me and how I can grow into this skill set. And many times people in the Dodge City community have taken a chance on me, and it's sometimes worked, sometimes it's been hard, but we've always worked it out. And so I would ask for your vote, not from a level of long-term, which is very respectable experience, and appreciate your hard work in that fact, but just there was some votes that didn't agree with my values that motivated me to run. And so I'm asking for your vote as a local representative, that you can come knock on my door all year, and I want to listen to your heart. I want to know what problems that you're facing and see what I can do as your local representative to solve those problems at the state or at the Dodge City level.
All right, Jason Goetz, thank you so much this evening. Also, thank you to Brad Ralph. You've been listening to the two candidates for the 119th District, Dodge City, on the Kansas Candidates Show, Smoky Hills PBS. I'm your moderator, Becky Kaiser. Thanks for joining us.
In our increasingly electrified society, that's where a resilient grid matters most. ITC Great Plains is ensuring the greater grid can meet our energy needs now and long into the future. Learn more at itc-holdings.com.